Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. The U.S. is racing to secure the critical minerals that we need for the clean energy transition, while also reducing our reliance on foreign adversaries. But the real question is whether we can do it without harming the planet that we're trying to save and the people on it. My name is Gracelin Baskaran. I'm the Research Director for the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS. I've been working on critical minerals for over a decade. I was previously based in South Africa's Platinum Belt, a metal that we need for hydrogen fuel cell technology, and have firsthand seen the challenges we face with supporting communities, firms, and governments as we work to build our security, and the difficulties we have while managing these externalities. Before we dive into today's very exciting book talk, I want to run through a few housekeeping things. First, we are in a very safe building. However, if there are any emergencies, please follow a CSIS staff member or use the very well-marked exit signs that we have. And second, if you're joining us online, we're so pleased to have you here. We hope you'll participate in the session as actively as those in the room, and we encourage you to send questions for our Q&A session at the end. Today's conversation is timely for many reasons. Most of you know that the U.S. is racing to build critical mineral security, but it's even more timely given that the U.S. Appeals Court just less than 10 days ago ruled that they will allow the federal government to give away thousands of acres in Arizona to Rio Tinto, a foreign company, for a copper mine, upholding a previous ruling and rejecting the argument from Native Americans that the land should be preserved for religious and cultural value. There's many things I'm looking forward to today's conversation for, but here are three key things I'm looking out for, and I hope you will too. First, is it possible to reconcile the need for increasing mineral production to reduce the effects of climate change without harming that environment in the process? Second, mining has become incredibly litigious in recent years. Is it possible to reduce the tension between environmental groups, mining firms, and policymakers? Can we reduce the domestic friendly fire that threatens our critical mineral security goals? And finally, does shifting the framing from climate to security alone change the urgency that we feel to achieve these goals, even with the trade-offs that may bring? I hope you'll enjoy this discussion as much as I will. And if you're wanting to learn more, we will be offering a one-day executive education course titled Building Critical Mineral Security for a Sustainable Future. The course will cross-examine the building and management of robust supply chains for natural resources that are essential for our national economic and energy security. Experts will discuss the economics and geopolitics of critical minerals, the responsible mining imperative, and how we can pursue sustainable mining. I want to turn it over now to Joseph Majkut, the director of our Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS, to introduce our author, Ernest Scheyder.
Thank you so much, Gracelin, and thank you everybody for coming this afternoon. I'm really excited to get into this really deeply reported book and to talk to Ernest about what he learned over the course of a few years. Ernest, welcome to CSIS.
Hey, it's great to be here.
And let me ask you to start at the beginning, not all the way back in Maine, but maybe, I get the impression, you cut your teeth as a reporter in energy on the shale revolution.
Yep.
At what point did you say, I need to turn my attention to critical minerals, or to minerals more generally? And what made you, what sparked your interest in this topic?
Well, I got started on oil and gas at the early days of the shale revolution. I was based in New York at the time for Reuters and was doing a lot of work in Ohio and Pennsylvania, chronicling how different populations were interacting with the pretty early days of the shale boom. And then Reuters gave me an offer I couldn't refuse and said, "You want to move to North Dakota?" That probably angered somebody. So I spent almost 2 years living in Williston, North Dakota, which was a fascinating opportunity to really drill down, if you'll forgive the pun, onto what was at the time one of the biggest energy revolutions really in the world. And then I had a chance, after about 2 years, to write about Exxon and Chevron and OPEC. But I started to hear increasing interest from some small quarters on lithium and copper. We started to see the rise in the demand for lithium-ion batteries, especially in the transportation space. Tesla at that time, obviously a very small company. This we're talking around 2014, 2015, 2016. But I became pretty curious about what this could mean, this sort of initial demand for this stuff. And when you just look at USGS reports, you started to see that the U.S. didn't really make a whole lot of these critical minerals. And so I decided to switch my focus professionally and dive into this new area. And the book really is an offshoot of about 5 or 6 years of diving into those areas and exploring where we're going to actually get the building blocks for this energy transition. And the key theme of the book really is around choice. What are the choices we're willing to make?
Those assembled here, you should buy the book if you haven't already. We've got some copies available outside. It's actually really interesting, and I want to congratulate you at the very top for the hard work that I think is evident that you did.
Thank you.
You arrived at the theme of choice. And I want to start there because one of the thing that I leave this book, having read it a couple times now, is I'm frustrated by your editorial ambivalence, right? I wanted like either a strong case for more development or I wanted a strong case for protecting the natural environment.
Right.
And I when I read it, Ernest, I get both. So what, in your mind, who makes these choices? Right? Who decides what mines we build, which minerals we prioritize, how we make these things economical? What did you learn in your reporting that you can now point to help us understand who the principal agents are?
I mean, if I've learned one thing from the book is you get to ask one question of your audience. And the question that I'm asking really is, what are the choices we're willing to make? And I gave the introduction about my time in oil and gas on purpose because when I used to write about oil and gas, I would go back to New York to visit friends and family, and I would get the question, fracking, good or bad? And invariably it would be from somebody that was drinking out of a red Solo cup, wearing a polyester shirt, and had taken a gasoline-powered taxi to where we were that day. And so I would often answer the question by saying, I'm not going to tell you what I think about fracking. I'm going to say, what do you think about fracking? Because implicitly, you support it by your lifestyle choices.
Right.
And I think with oil and gas, a lot of people tend to fall in either sort of one camp or the other. Yes, we need it, or no, we don't need it at all because of climate issues. But when I transitioned to covering the metals space, 98, 99%, or 99.9% of people I would talk to all said yes. Like, we want more lithium and copper and nickel and cobalt. We want cell phones. We want solar panels. We think the climate is something that needs to be addressed and saved. But the tension came around, okay, well, where are we going to actually get these building blocks? Nobody wants a mine in their backyard. There's a reason NIMBY is a popular phrase that's on bumper stickers. And so to answer your question, Joseph, around who should be making the choices, we should be making the choices because we direct our policymakers to how to make these choices, and they take their cue from us as taxpayers, as citizens. But we're not really grappling with those choices now. We just sort of expect to show up to a store and have these building blocks made with these products.
Right.
You know, it was 4 years.
Can I interrupt that?
Sure,
There's
yeah.
a vignette in here. You're walking around the area, I think of around Rio Lake Ridge.
Yep.
Might be Thacker Pass. All this stuff happens in Nevada for some reason. And in there, you're talking to an environmental advocate who's opposing the development of this mine.
Yep.
I think wanting to protect a desert wildflower, the
Yes.
Phoenix buckwheat.
Yep.
And you ask that person directly, right? You're an environmental campaigner. You know that we need to do energy transition to prevent, I don't know how many untold thousands of small native flowering wildflowers around the world from extinction because of the effects of climate change. And you realize we need more lithium. And the answer was basically like, yes, but not here.
Correct. Yep.
Right? There's probably a person like that for every proposed project, no?
Correct. Yeah. The more that I chronicled each individual project across the United States, and the book mostly looks at projects in the United States on purpose, the more you got to see folks that said, just like this gentleman, yes, I support the transition, but just not here. And when you add that all up and you look at the sheer demand need for all these critical minerals, you just look at the back of an envelope and realize when you do the math, how are we going to get these supplies? And so that's also what I bring to the reader here in the book is to say, okay, well, we can have legitimate opposition for each of these projects, but if we're not actually debating what are the standards and where and how and why we should be producing these critical minerals, then we're going to end up with a big zero in terms of production.
Right. And okay, so then we make this decision, our policymakers make the decision. One of the things that's also discussed in the book, and as I've studied this issue, I've come to realize is we also have to have firms making these decisions, right? Eventually, some profit-seeking entity needs to make an investment in a mine because they're confident enough it's going to work, they're confident enough in the market. the book is, takes for granted that energy transition will drive increases in demand for lithium, maybe cobalt, maybe nickel, certainly graphite. What do you, looking back, having started now 4 or 5 on this project 5, 6 years ago, has your demand outlook changed? Your personal sense of where demand is going or how it may grow?
I think, the answer is yes, and only north,
Only
right?
in the upward direction?
Correct, yeah.
That's not a positive story given what I've read, Ernest.
Well, it just, think of everything in our lives that are going electric now. It's not just about transportation. I have a chapter in the book that looks at leaf blowers, which sounds sort of whimsy and basic, but a few years ago, I got a house and I got a backyard, and I decided to go all in on the electric gadgets that sort of can help with lawn care. I was beginning to really get earnest about writing this book.
I love that chapter, by the way, because I thought the same thing about my electric weed trimmer.
Yeah, same thing. We're sitting in a city right now where two-stroke leaf blowers, are actually illegal.
Right.
Washington, D.C. has outlawed them. And so if we want to save the planet, sort of the main message point from manufacturers is go electric. And so if you get an electric leaf blower, then you beg the question, okay, well, where does the copper come from? Where does the cobalt come from? Where does the nickel come from? Was the cobalt taken out of the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo by a small child? And that's not hyperbole. That can actually happen sometimes, and it's nearly impossible to trace it. And I got to tell you, I have a lot of resources at my disposal in my day job, and I couldn't figure out where any of the metals came from inside this electric leaf blower.
Yeah.
And so then you just magnify that one leaf blower by the gargantuan number of electronic devices that we all own. Everyone in this room right now has a cell phone in their pocket. We're being recorded by a camera with tons of critical minerals inside of it. There's copper wiring in these walls. That's just in this room where we are right now. Then magnified across the city and across the country and the world, really. And everyone's increasingly going electric and everything. So that's why these demand projections continue to increase. And it's about so much more than just transportation.
But should you also think about, or do you have an evolving view on things like substitution, technology innovation, where new generations of EV batteries might try to get the cobalt out, or may try to use lithium more judiciously? Has that changed anything in the past few years, or is it just the sort of like steady march toward the Paris goals and the improvement of all these products means that the world's going to be minerals hungry for the next 30 years?
I think it's all of those are the same thing.
Okay.
Cobalt, Elon Musk famously has said he wants to get cobalt out of Tesla's batteries.
Right.
And so they're decreasing the volume in each battery. But if the number of Teslas, just to take Tesla as one manufacturer, is going to increase, and it is, then obviously the sheer volume that they will need will increase. Other manufacturers prefer cobalt in their batteries, depending on the end use and the design for that. So we are starting to see more cobalt there. And that's just cobalt, though. But, take new battery technologies that are coming down the pike, solid state. Right now, lithium-ion batteries are sort of the main workhorse for electronics. Solid state could replace lithium-ion batteries. It's anyone's guess when, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But even solid state takes even more lithium than a lithium-ion battery. Right now, Albemarle, the world's largest lithium company, headquartered in North Carolina, they are employing an army of scientists to figure out how to shove more lithium into a lithium-ion battery. So right now, lithium primarily goes into the cathode, and they're figuring out how can we make an anode, which right now is made mostly with graphite, how can we basically shove that chock full of lithium and have the same results. So they're figuring out more ways to put that in there. So that's just focusing on lithium right now. So I don't mean to be hyperbolic or sort of, the sky is falling, but the demand for all of these minerals is only going to go increase the more we use electronic gadgets every single day. Think of Alexa, for instance, or these home devices that we all have that we didn't have 5 years ago. That's another common example.
Yeah, but I got to say, I do think that the mass of this, reading your book and everything that you read in the press, it's EV batteries, right? For the time, for right now.
Sure.
Just in turn, 7 kilograms of lithium, 25 kilograms of graphite. That's just where the big demand plug is going to come. Let me ask you why you focused on the United States. I could venture a guess, but I would like to hear your answer.
Sure. I think for too long, people in the United States especially have exported, whether literally or sort of in the back of their minds, the production of the building blocks that they'll use every single day. So what I wanted to bring to an American audience especially was this wrestling with where, how, and why we hope to get the building blocks for what we produce. Like, if I think everyone in this room can say we don't want a 7-year-old in the Congo mining cobalt. I mean, I think that's a pretty basic, assertion.
Probably a widely shared view. Yeah,
Yes. But do we want northern Idaho dug up to produce a lot of cobalt?
Yeah. Right.
And, therein sort of lies the tension. Would we let the place that maybe we enjoyed going fishing or camping or hiking as a young kid in order to get, have it be dug up in order to get the cobalt that goes into our phone? Gracelin was sharing the recent example of the Resolution copper case, which has been winding its way through the courts. This involves a mine in eastern Arizona that, if developed, would destroy a site of religious and cultural importance to the San Carlos Apache people. And they have been shouting from the rooftops that this would be like tearing up St. Peter's Basilica if you found lithium underneath St. Peter's Basilica. But this mine would produce 25% of the copper that the United States gobbles up.
Right.
So it's an insane amount of copper. But we're not really having to grapple with those because we just expected copper to come from another part of the world. But I think if we learned anything from the coronavirus pandemic, it's that really long supply chains are not the best. Those can be interrupted by natural disasters, by armed conflicts, by weather, by anything else. And if we're going to get serious about climate change, importing lithium or nickel or copper from the other side of the world is probably also not the best way.
Right.
So we have to be having a collective wrestling with, should we be doing this here at home? What are the standards by which we're going to allow mining? Should we be focusing more on substitution, to your earlier point, Joseph? And what are the ways that we want to actually go green and have this transition?
So to what extent, I mean, we're here in Washington, right? To what extent do you feel that that's a conversation that's going to be principally policy driven, right? Sort of like, are we spending these tax credits the right way? Are we, using the Clean Water Act appropriately? Is it going to be politically driven? Do we even have the right framework? Do we need new legislation? Is it reasonable to say that the laws that govern mining on federal land should be updated once every 200 years?
Don't get ahead of yourself. Yeah.
Or is it, I'm going to throw this out to you, but is this sort of a cultural change that needs to occur? Because when I read your book, I see the U.S. as a particularly painful place for mining development because we have, protect constitutional rights with great fervor. People like an underdog. And I read your book, and I'm a person who thinks we need a lot more mining, but I'm very sympathetic, maybe that is a compliment to you, to the people who are opposing these projects for all the reasons that they cite. So how do you think about the U.S. evolving into this new era? Is it, it doesn't feel like something to me that just bureaucrats are going to figure out.
Right. I would say it has to start with a cultural conversation among us all, everyday citizens, about what are the standards we are willing to accept for mining. Mining for the better part of the past 75 years has actually been on the decrease in the United States. And if you thought of mining, you probably thought of coal mining. And that's even though, Arizona for a while has still been a big copper producing state. But by and large, the United States has not been thought of as a major mining jurisdiction since probably, I would say, the years after World War II. It was the 1990s that the U.S. actually got rid of the Bureau of Mines. It was part of a round of budget cuts during the Clinton administration.
Right.
And so we don't really sort of have a main depository anymore that would look after mining the way you would like the EPA for the environment, or Department of the Interior, which has a different mandate. It's to steward the land rather than sort of, mine the land. And so we also don't really teach mining that much in our universities anymore. There's only about 10 or 11 mining accredited schools in the United States. There's several hundred in China. And I can tell you right now that if you know a kid who's 18 or 19 and deciding what to do for school, get at me after this, because I know many professors that will give that kid a free ride. They are clamoring for students right now. We just don't have an appreciation for mining in this country, and there's no way around the fact that mining is loud and dirty, but better technology innovation, better ways of using science will make it better and increase the ways that we're going to be able to get these critical minerals. You alluded to legislation, though, and I think there is a legislative approach here, or a policy approach. The mining law that's governed mining in the United States has been around since 1872. That, it's in the years after the Civil War.
Signed by Ulysses S. Grant.
Signed by Ulysses S. Grant, and it was designed to increase the population in the U.S. West. Those of you who have been in California recently know that it's got a lot of people, and the main thrust of the goal of 1872 has been met. One of the other quirks of that is that mining companies don't pay royalties to me and you, to taxpayers, for copper and lithium and other metals they take out of the ground. Oil and gas companies would kill for that perk. They do pay royalties to the federal government when they operate on federal land. And there's many other things that have been around since 1872 that probably should be updated, but they're only going to be updated if we as voters, as we as citizens, say that we want this brought into the 21st century. You know, the mining law of 1872 never imagined people driving, well, period, but let alone driving electric cars and all the copper and lithium and nickel that was going to go along with that. So I guess to answer your question, I would say it's got to be a two-pronged approach. We have to have a broader cultural discussion and broader awareness and education about mining and how important it is, as well as a policy approach.
I want to talk about the sort of like three core assumptions in your book.
Sure.
That I feel it holds and they are commonly held. One is that the U.S. has some of the strictest mining standards globally.
Yes.
Now, in part that's true because we don't do a lot of mining, maybe, or maybe it prevents mining. How true do you think that is?
I think it's certainly true when we look at the multitude of federal layers. So if you were looking for operations on federal land, you have got the Fish and Wildlife Service potentially, you've got the EPA potentially, you've got many other agencies, then you've got state oversight, depending on obviously which state you're in.
We counted once, and I think it's like 11 or 12 agencies that you got to get a thumbs up from at some point.
That depends, but you know, take this, Joseph. I mean, let's say you owned 1,000 acres in Nevada and you wanted to like mine copper there. Like, how would you start? Who would you call?
Do I own it? Oh, I don't know. Who would I call?
That's a very good question. Like it all depends on a whole host of factors.
Probably the state.
That are very unclear.
Yeah.
So, well, maybe, but if you've got let's just say you have a body of water flowing through there, maybe you call the EPA for Waters of the USA. Like, so there's all these sort of interesting things that overlap there, and it becomes very confusing as to how to actually start the process. And then you can get 5 years in and then realize, well, you didn't do X, Y, Z 5 years ago.
My answer. I'm going to call my lawyer.
Okay, well, we are in DC, so.
Okay, that's good. One of the other ones is that there is inherently going to be a trade-off.
Yes.
That, you and I were talking in our pre-call about the resolution project, right? Because there's a lovely term of art that the miners clearly never thought about the need for PR when they were going to evacuate
Which
all
is
this.
in the book as a tease.
Yeah, it's in the book, yeah. But it's a large copper deposit. It's very, very deep underground. My kind of like rough understanding of the mining process is you send a bunch of people and equipment down there. They basically mine out this enormous cavern to capture all this copper deposit, 7,000 feet underground or whatever. Eventually that cavern that they mine out is going to collapse.
Yes.
And this disturbs the surface of the earth and creates what people in the industry call a glory hole.
Yes.
I want to return to resolution because that has caused all sorts of issues with that particular project. But let's think again about this inevitable trade-off. How real is this inevitable trade-off between environmental impact and mining, and can it be reduced?
I think the short answer is yes, it can be reduced. What are the standards by which we allow mining? Would necessitate, in this particular example, for instance, does that crater have to happen? And I think the answer is probably no, depending on how you engineer the mine, but that means you get less copper. And in this, we'll sort of get into the back and forth. It's in chapter 2. But there are ways potentially to mitigate that large crater. And the company, Rio Tinto, and its minority partner BHP have been saying that they, in order to study the engineering and decide whether or not that would happen, they need to have full ownership of the land.
Right.
Which is a non-starter for Apache Stronghold and the same colors Apache that oppose them for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there are ways. There are examples of other mines that have actually had their plans reworked in order to avoid surface disturbance. And so it can happen. And so perhaps this is a way forward here where all sides are able to sort of have their cake and eat it too. But in order to do that, then we have to have broader dialogue and broader understanding of the standards that we expect. And that's not happening right now.
Okay. Maybe actually, let's pause there and talk a little bit about the resolution project. So, there's the way that this thing was planned, there's going to be environmental impact. And I don't want to pick on resolution, but it's good to have an example. Can you explain to us a little bit of the conflict that arose with respect to that particular area?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a site that currently right now is a federal campground. And as the legend goes, Eisenhower's wife visited it during his presidency and loved it so much, she got him to make it a federal campground. Whether that's true or not, we'll say that it is. We'll choose to believe that it is. Though that site has been, for generations, also home to religious ceremonies for the San Carlos Apache people, who have had, I think it's unfortunate to say, a very tortured interaction with the U.S. government. The San Carlos Apache Reservation is actually about 40 miles away from this area, but it's still part of the cultural and historical lands of the San Carlos Apache, right. And so they will go back there and do their ceremonies. The U.S. government did a lot of atrocious things to these people and try to integrate them through forced assimilation into American society, and the various pieces of legislation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s tried to overturn that. And so where we are today is that in the 1990s, late 2000s, I would actually say, this massive copper deposit was found in this part of Arizona that has had copper mining for about 200 years. Mm-hmm. But as Joseph was saying, it's about 7,000 feet underground. And in order to get at it, the company, Rio Tinto, realized that perhaps it would have to spend a gargantuan amount of money to do this. They partnered up with BHP, and they decided that they would then focus on trying to actually get access to the land through what's known as a land swap. Former Senator John McCain obviously represented Arizona, was a big proponent of this when he was alive and in office, and was able to actually get this land swap into the 2014 NDAA, which was it was a must-pass. President Obama signed it reluctantly. Yep. If he had not signed it, the Pentagon would have not had a budget, which obviously would not have been good.
I mean, you have to compliment the parliamentarian craft, right?
It was added literally at midnight. Yeah, so when people say it was a midnight edition, it literally was right. A midnight edition.
But something that the senator had fought for a long time.
Correct, yeah. He'd been very vocal about this, and he tried to do it standalone, I should say. It did not pass. And so the NDAA passed. And as part of that, it required the U.S. federal government to do an environmental study. And all this time, the San Carlos Apache began to organize and really fight this and try to get it overturned in their own version of a standalone legislation that still to this day has not passed. What happened in January 2021, as we fast forward, we all know what happened on January 6th. About 10 days later, President Trump issued this environmental report. Though the timing was not ideal for the mining industry, but the environmental report was out. And so the countdown was on to actually transfer this land. The report was out. The stipulations of the 2014 NDAA were met. President Biden's inaugurated, comes into office, and he unpublishes the report. He puts the genie back into the bottle. How you unpublish a report? He did it. So, right. And so that is sort of where we are today on the executive side. Meanwhile, the San Carlos Apache and their allies, known as Apache Stronghold, filed a suit in U.S. District Court where they did lose. Their main argument was that the U.S. government should stop this land transfer because it would impede their ability to worship their religious deities. It was a RFRA, RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, I believe. I might be getting the third word wrong, but basically it was a religious rights argument that they would not be allowed, that this would be an undue burden on their ability to practice their freedom of religion.
Right.
And so that argument failed in U.S. District Court. It failed in the U.S. Appeals Court in the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco on a three-judge panel, And then on Friday, as Gracelin was saying, two Fridays ago, it failed on the full en banc in the Ninth Circuit. It'll probably be appealed to SCOTUS, and we'll see if SCOTUS will actually take it. Right. Justice Gorsuch has voiced strong support for Native American issues in the past, so I would assume that perhaps he would be a yes vote for that.
Right.
But it'll get at this core issue of religious rights, and it'll go smack dab right up against the energy transition. Like, what matters more here? Does the U.S. government taking this land constitute an undue burden on the San Carlos Apache? And some of the rulings that some of the citations that the judges on the full Ninth Circuit cited looked at, for instance, if you take an old Catholic church and you turn it into, as they have in San Francisco, into a roller rink, does that mean that Catholics can't worship there anymore? Well, they can worship elsewhere, some of the other judges were saying,
Right.
just not at this one building right now. And so you're starting to see arguments about that. Can the government also do what it wants with its own land?
Yeah.
That's another argument, I mean, for instance, if it was about national security and this was a need for an Air Force base right there, and this is the perfect spot for an Air Force base, would we be having the same discussion?
Right.
And so these get into the complex areas. And to your point at the beginning, Joseph, you're right. I don't really say one way or the other what I actually believe.
Oh, it's really frustrating.
But I think that's not really
not the role of a journalist. Yeah.
Well, no, I purposely went into this book not wanting to do that because I wanted people to have to grapple with this stickiness here.
Yeah.
I of course have my opinions,
right.
but I want everyone in this room and everyone who reads the book to have to grapple with that for her or himself.
Well, and I would argue that, because you're dealing with this like sort of values-based judgment, right? There's like aesthetics here.
Yes.
There's the morality of industrialization. There is the question of who has rights to determine what happens on federal land or on their own land. And then there's this market question of like, how much of the stuff do we need and how much money should people make producing it? Like no one person can really answer it. So you kind of return to the question of like, why the US? Well, it's possible that a constitutional democracy with a strong preference for property rights is going to have a hard time adjudicating these arguments.
Yep.
Right? If we had a different governing structure where the state had a lot more power or a lot more authority over these kinds of things, it might be easier to produce.
Yes, yeah. China is a repeat example in the book. They have a command control economy, obviously, and I argue in the book strongly in one of the chapters that their moves to center control on the rare earths industry made it the second largest economy in the world. And partly that was because it was able to take huge deposits within its own borders and basically just develop them en masse without environmental standards that we would consider here in the United States acceptable. China has a waste pit or a tailings pond at its rare earths mine larger than New York's Central Park. Would that fly in Washington, D.C.? Probably not.
Maybe in Montana. Let me ask you, you said something in the conversation, colleagues, let me say, where you should warm up because we're going to invite questions from the audience here in a moment. But I got a couple more for Ernest. You said something key there, right? If this was a military base, if this was a national security need, you think like these kinds of considerations might not get the same hearing. Whether it's religious issues or water use or some buckwheat, any of the numerous sort of environmental issues that you point
If there
out
was
in the
another
book.
9/11 or Pearl Harbor, I think it would very quickly be a different conversation. Yes.
And one, this is CSIS. We're a national strategy and security think tank. The program I work in cut its teeth on energy security, particularly in oil markets.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think this is going to become? This is the third assumption in your book, and it's the one that I actually think is like probably the most debatable, that the energy security story is going to become one of who controls the supply chains of lithium and nickel and copper in the period of energy transition. Like, you state that in the book. Do you think that's going to privilege these kinds of projects going forward? Or as the response can equally be, let's not do energy transition?
Well, I think without a doubt, whoever does control these critical minerals will control the 21st century economy the way that crude oil defined the 20th century economy. And I think that's just, there's no question for that because we are increasingly seeing the demand spike. And so we have to be having the discussion about, okay, well, if we don't want to produce them here, are we comfortable with other parts of the world using them as geopolitical weapons? China has used its control of rare earths, for instance, as an economic weapon. We saw this in 2010 with Japan, so that's just one example right now. So I don't necessarily think, it's, framing the question like, is it going to actually be a weapon? It is a weapon. It is an instrument of economic control right now. And the more and more we use devices powered by lithium-ion batteries and built with all these critical minerals, that's only going to further heighten the need to be producing them domestically or being comfortable with the standards that others use and the ways that they use them as economic weapons. And so these are the things that I think we really have to be thinking through. But I mean, I guess to your point, maybe to drill down more specifically, there are two different approaches to energy, I think, especially as we get closer to November. And not to get too political here, but I think each camp that are, we have President Biden has one approach and former President Trump has his own approach to energy. I think President Trump looks at energy, and especially around critical minerals, through a national security lens. And I think President Biden looks at it through a climate change lens. And how you approach each of those areas, I think, will affect how you interact with policy decisions around those fronts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, one thing I think about a lot is sort of the Washington consensus, right? And there's this feeling now that the Washington consensus is fracturing. I definitely don't think it's the same as it was in the 1980s or 90s. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how do you kind of align incentives to pursue public policy change or improvement that match national security issues with climate imperative? And minerals seems to be a place that's kind of open season to figure out some sweet spots right there.
Sweet spots, but then also some really interesting partnerships that you would have never expected. We were talking about resolution. The main law firm defending the San Carlos Apache is Beckett, which is a very conservative law firm. We probably would have never ever thought that they would be aligned with Native American religious interests, and yet here they are. And so they're starting to see some interesting overlays there. And so I do think, but then on the flip side is that we do tend to see some Republicans and Democrats, well, a lot of Republicans and Democrats sort of say we have to be working on ways to increase our own domestic production, or at least think through these areas. Eric Swalwell and I always mispronounce his name, I'm sorry, Guy Rentschler, he's a Republican from Pennsylvania, formed the House Critical Materials Conference. And here are two people that are perhaps on the polar ends of the political spectrum, but came together on this really important and complex issue. And so we're starting to see some interesting alliances that perhaps you would have never, ever thought in the oil and gas sphere.
Are you game for a rapid fire round of kind of overrated, underrated?
I feel like I'm with Andy Cohen or something.
Yeah, well, this is inspired by the Tyler Cowen podcast, but it's actually a good mechanism, I think. We'll see if we do it well.
Okay.
If we do it well. Voluntary initiatives for responsible mining assurance.
I think it's underrated, and I think we should get more attention.
Critical minerals provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure law.
I think it needs to get more people need to know about it. So I guess we'll say underrated.
In what way do you think more people need to know about it? Like which do you think are most important? Is it investments in processing? Is it sort of resource surveys? What do we need to know?
Investments in processing. I think processing is the silent hero of this whole debate. Like, I mean, obviously you can take it out of the ground, but if you can't turn it into a usable form to go into a battery, then you just own rock.
Right.
So I think it's extremely important to be having that. And most people don't realize that federal funds can't go to dig holes in the ground. They can only go to process.
What about the minerals provisions of the IRA, which say you only get the full tax credit on your EV if you've got a mineral supply chain that runs through North America or free trade agreement countries?
I think overrated and underrated, because nobody understands how the IRA is going to actually be implemented. Is Argentina lithium IRA compliant? Depending on who you talk to, yes. Depending on who you talk to, no. Argentina does not have a U.S. free trade deal.
Right.
But a lot of companies that operate in Argentina say yes, because they might take it out of the ground in Argentina and they do some minor processing, but then do the bulk of the processing in the United States. But why Argentina lithium and not cobalt from the DRC?
Right.
If anybody has the answer, find me after.
Permitting reform as a way of speeding access to minerals or building secure supply chains.
I think underrated. Not a lot of people know that we've had this mining law since 1872, and I think the more people do, their eyes pop out of their head.
Okay, last one. Ready? Themes buckwheat.
I think Teams Buckwheat is, I'll just say read the book. It is the core part of the book, and I use it as the narrative in 3 chapters. And when you get to the end, you'll realize why.
Good answer. Colleagues, if you want to have a question, we have a runner with a microphone here. We got a couple hands going up. Hallie's going to come around. Ernest, what did I not ask while we wait for the first questioner? If we can start in the center and we'll go over here.
Well, I mean, let's
Oh,
just
you're ready to go? Please,
yeah.
sir, introduce yourself. Remember, questions have a brief propositional statement followed by a sentence that goes up at the end.
course.
Thank you kindly.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ujjwala Pluri. I work at U.S. Customs Office of Trade. And my question is, can we use modern technologies like artificial intelligence and remote sensing to not only lessen the environmental impact of mining, but also work in consultation with Native American groups to promote their social and economic empowerment in return for use of their land? Like, for example, come up with right-sharing agreements.
I guess to answer your first question, I mean, I find AI fascinating. I think like most people probably in this room, and I think the short answer is yes. Like AI is being used to study geological data and help miners say, okay, well maybe we have a higher rate of success, potentially higher rate of success if we dig here based on crunching all of this data that we do have, and then be able to say, okay, if we focus the orbit here, then we're going to have a higher rate of success. I mean, miners have more data than, perhaps many other industries that just don't know what to do with it. And then your second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat it again?
Coming to some sort of right-sharing agreement with the Native American tribes to promote their economic and social
sure.
development in return,
Yeah.
for using that land.
Yeah, so this historically for any local population really has sort of been the carrot by which the mining industry has interacted with host communities. Increasingly with members of religious faiths, especially indigenous communities, though, there's no check large enough that you could write that would get social license to operate. So therein lies the rub.
Hi, Osmar, the retired banker. Two observations and a question. One is, as we navigate through this whole critical mineral process and difficulties that you've been talking about, the demand for power and electricity continues to expand, as I thought was pointed out in a very good Washington Post article over the weekend. So that's observation one. Two, money's not going to flow while we've got this mess. There's plenty of capital, but these are long-term investments, and until this gets sorted out, you can't fund it, and so won't. So I'm skeptical on lots of things that you address in your book. The question is, I think you have a full-time job. How'd you find time to write the book?
To your point on money, I mean, you're absolutely right, Osmar. Like, there's not going to be major capital flows. We've seen some capital flows, certainly, but we're not going to see the required needing to flow until we actually have more permitting clarity. The resolution example is one that perhaps is a cautionary tale. Rio Tinto and BHP have spent more than $2 billion US, and they have not mined an ounce of copper yet. In terms of my free time, I have had very little free time the past few years. The book does build off of my work at Reuters, so some of the projects in the book I did start to write about at Reuters, but I basically spent every free minute I had in 2022, every second of vacation and a book leave to sort of bang this out. And I wanted to visit most of the sites again if I hadn't been there, or go there on my own. And I also wanted to look at some specific tensions internationally. So there's one chapter in the book, especially that looks at Bolivia, world's largest lithium resource. There's been a huge fight to access that. There's geopolitical implications around that. There's a technology question around that have parallels to what's going on in the United States. So I did go to Salar de Uyuni as part of the book.
So actually that brings us to a question from the online audience. I'm sorry, I don't know this person's name, but we'll work it in. The question is, to what extent the U.S. can be a role model, and kind of sort of to contrast, I'm guessing, with China. You have Bolivia in the book, which Chinese firms ended up.
Yeah.
Sorry, spoiler alert, but like Chinese firms ended up winning those contracts or concessions. But we've got a whole diplomatic enterprise that has sprung up over the last few years that's trying to develop, get Western firms and offtake contracts for U.S. companies from mines all around the world at very high environmental standards. The whole political pitch is, this is less the extract value and build stuff in China. We want to work with the countries to develop their economies and meet U.S. security needs. Is that just vapor?
Well, I would say we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act earlier. It definitely has created two worlds in the world right now. I mean, you've got countries that have U.S. free trade deals that can access IRA-compliant tax credits, and countries that don't. And on the African continent, for instance, there's only one country that has a U.S. free trade deal, and that's Morocco.
Right.
Morocco does not have a lot of critical minerals within its borders.
It's about to have a lot of battery factories, though.
It is probably going to have a lot of battery factories, yes. We have seen Jose Fernandez from the State Department signing a lot of what are known as MSPs, mineral security partnerships with various countries around the world, including Zambia and the DRC, which do have a lot of copper and cobalt. And we'll see how that sort of plays out. It does represent, it seems on the surface, an attempt by Washington to forge connections with countries that have had historically large investments by China. You know, I chronicle in the book how one of the largest cobalt mines in the world, Tenke Fumigenzi in the DRC, was owned by an American company, but it got into financial dire straits due to some ill-timed investments in oil and gas, and it actually had to sell it to a Chinese company.
And interestingly, it was Carl Icahn who was pressuring them to sell, right?
It was Carl Icahn, yes, ironically. And that company has been kicking itself ever since, but it had to sell it to financial reasons, to stay afloat financially. And now it's owned by CMOC, and the interactions between the company and the host community has decreased, has gone downhill.
So plausible, but we actually need to do it.
Correct.
Cool. Over here, the gentleman and then the person in the front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Colin Hendricks. I'm at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what role there is for trade. So you alluded to the fact that it might be suboptimal to be relying on a supplier halfway around the world. I think we all know we're talking about China by and large, but halfway around the world as well, you have Australia. You have countries like Canada. These are advanced democracies that have much more permissive kind of mining environments in terms of regulation. And to what extent should the United States be approaching this according to, I guess, a friend-shoring logic as opposed to a Fortress America kind of logic? And then that raises a secondary question, which is, who should the United States be considering friends for these kinds of purposes? Thank you.
Right, thanks for the question. I think the IRA does sort of have some frameworks here. I mean, Australia and Chile and Canada have U.S. free trade deals, and the mining industries in those countries are very happy, for obvious reasons, about the IRA. A point that I make in the book is, though, that if part of the energy transition is designed to address climate change, you know, taking copper or lithium out of the ground in Western Australia and then shipping it to a processing plant in China and then shipping it to Japan to be put into a cathode and then being shipped back across the Pacific Ocean to an EV plant in, say, Nevada, does that make sense in terms of a carbon emissions profile perspective? I would argue probably not. And so, you know, we're starting to see a move towards more regionalization, not necessarily all domestic production, but the European Union, for instance, is being very vocal about the fact that it wants to increase production within its own borders of these critical minerals, maybe not necessarily just one country, but trying within its own borders. And I think you'll start to see that trend happen more and more and more. But the question becomes for countries like Australia or Chile, which are geographically removed from the United States, you know, sort of which orbit do they fall into?
So I hear these ambitions, but I feel like this all runs up against the problem of cost.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. That, like, you know, I don't think of, I mean, the U.S., I don't think of Europe as a place where it's like a low-cost mining environment, right? And so much of the story of these energy transition technologies is falling costs, beating out incumbent technologies to help drive greenhouse gas emissions. So, like, are we, you know, how much are we hearing, like, government ambition versus, like, an articulated vision of what to do?
Ooh. So
you're meeting with government people tomorrow? Because you can just like really let it rip.
The president and the vice president and I are having a heart-to-heart first thing at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. I mean, we could be here all night talking about that, Joseph. I think, yes, you're right. Cost does come up against all of the other ambitions we have for the energy transition, namely greenhouse gas reduction, efficiency, technology brings efficiency, all of these other things. Our rising ESG standards. You know, we have higher ESG standards today than we did 100 years ago. That's just a fact.
Yep.
And we also know that there are jurisdictions in the world that don't have ESG standards but are willing to produce these metals at ways that we wouldn't find acceptable. And so maybe a question I would pose to the audience is, are we willing to pay more for a cell phone, for instance, knowing that the nickel in there was produced ethically and at higher environmental standards versus just getting the cheapest cell phone possible?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Ann Vroom. I'm in sort of the private equity side of things. I'll play a bit of contrarian in asking, are we overreacting? And the reason as to the magnitude of the challenge, you talk about the instance of electric cars, and they've had a tremendous growth in the past 10, 12 years. But there's some signs that growth is plateauing as a percentage, and there's still a small percentage of our overall actual portfolio of private vehicle transport. So I'm just wondering if we're not getting pressure to create a sense of a crisis from companies that are going to make a profit from reacting to that crisis, from our loosening mining standards, for example, or downplaying the creation of vulnerabilities, as well as things like disposal of lithium batteries, in the interest of promoting the electric vehicles. So it's just a generic question. Are we just going another one of these cycles where when we come back a generation from now, Rio Tinto is the only one that really benefited from all of this? And we've moved to nuclear, electrics have plateaued out, and it was not the crisis it seems to be. Thank you.
The other way, I mean, if I may take moderator's prerogative, I think one of the other things that I sort of wonder is, like, you recall the Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon bet, right? That, like, price increases lead to innovation, which increase supply in a way that maybe, Washington can't keep its hands off stuff, but might not be necessary for the overall problem.
Well, I think the true answer is that the war below will spark a necessary conversation to solve all of these issues. I think that's, but no, thank you for the question. I think yes, we look at transportation right now, especially EV penetration, and we do notice a leveling off due to several factors. Partly because they're just too damn expensive right now. The average consumer in the United States is probably not going to want to spend $40,000 or $50,000 on an electric car that only goes 200 or 300 miles on a single charge. And so, that's one of the factors that's limiting adoption there. But when we look at some of the other electronics out there that we know that are going electric, or just the sheer increase in electronics in general, and we look at the current production of these critical minerals, I would sort of maybe agree with you that, we shouldn't say have a sky is falling mentality, but we should be having a healthy debate about where we want to get this. The CEOs of copper companies, and yes, they do talk their book, that's their job, but they look at the sheer data on projections, and when we look at how much copper is in warehousings, for instance, right now, and that's obviously a short-term metric, and then when we lay that up against production at mines across the world, we sort of ask, okay, where is this copper going to come from? Part of the answer may be recycling, and I do explore in the book the history of Redwood by J.B. Straubel, formerly of Tesla, and Li-Cycle from A.J. Kachar, formerly of Hatch, and sort of look at the different approaches that those companies have to recycling. And part of it is also going to get back to, yes, you and I, because we have to be recycling more too, and actually have a reflex for recycling. I don't know about you, but I know I have a drawer at home filled with 4 old cell phones. And I would venture, I guess, that most of us have that as well. And that's just a cell phone. Now, if we all do start to get electric vehicles or electric leaf blowers,
right,
like Joseph and I do, because we're trendsetters, what's going to happen when those lithium-ion batteries and the leaf blowers reach end of life, and how would I recycle it?
Yeah.
I would leave you maybe with with a very short story. If you have an internal combustion engine car right now, it's powered by a lead-acid battery. And if that battery dies, let's just say, if it unfortunately dies as you drive out of here today, you would go to a dealership, you would pay for a new lead-acid battery, and what you don't even realize is that there's a small charge based on that new battery that you buy that actually pays for the recycling of the old one that you turn in. And there's this whole ecosphere that has grown the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years that you don't even notice that it's happening. That old lead-acid battery is broken down, the parts are rejiggered, and it's put into a new lead-acid battery for me or Joseph or somebody to buy. That kind of standardization has not really happened yet for electric vehicle batteries. We've got many different types of chemistries that are out there, whether it's in an electric vehicle or in our leaf blower battery. And I think it's going to have to take more standardization, more policy focus by the administrations of various countries in order to sort of get to that sort of critical mass. And that will actually decrease the reliance on what's called virgin or greenfield mines. Mining CEOs know that there's going to be a day when they dig the last hole in the ground.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe. But I really like that string trimmer. My biggest concern is my sons will never know the joy of operating a little two-stroke engine and having their father yell at them, "You flooding it!"
That won't scar them.
Well, unfortunately. We're going to close. I see there's a few more questions. We have an hour with Ernest outside with a few refreshments. So thank you all for joining us. I want to close with the text because you went through the hard work of writing this whole book. I've got 2.5 paragraphs here in that blog that I think are really interesting. I can read them, or if you want to, you can. Your choice, sir.
I'm happy to read it.
Okay, excellent. While you orient yourself, I think, to this paragraph, and then I have a stop mark on the next page. The chapter concludes in January 23 when the Department of Energy announces its intention to make a loan to Ioneer, the company that's developing Rhyolite Ridge project, over, kind of implicitly saying that we'll get over this issue involving the buckwheat.
Yep.
And then Ernest in this selection does a very nice job kind of covering the various perspectives, the decision makers, and the decision points that we're all going to have to confront. So please lend him your attention briefly, and thank you, Ernest, for joining us today.
Thanks, Joseph. Less than 2 weeks after the U.S. Energy Department lent money to Ioneer for its Nevada mine, the U.S. Interior Department said that no mining would be allowed on 225,504 acres in northern Minnesota for the next 2 decades, a region that included the proposed Twin Metals copper, cobalt, and nickel project. Officials in the Biden administration said that they did not think it incongruous that they were blocking the Twin Metals project while at the same time heralding the green energy transition. Quote, "The department sees the value in critical minerals and their critical importance to the future of this country," end quote, an administrative official said. Pete Stauber, who represented Minnesota in the U.S. House of Representatives, was incensed. Quote, "If Democrats were serious about developing renewable energy sources and breaking China's stranglehold on the global market, they would be flinging open the doors to responsible mineral development here in the U.S., end quote, he said. Wall Street was similarly perplexed. Quote, "If the U.S. intends to proceed with decarbonization, it will need copper, and blocking all domestic mine developments while expecting sufficient copper to be available may not be sensible. The U.S. may have to approve some projects," end quote, said the banking giant Credit Suisse. Later in 2023, a U.S. judge rejected a request from Twin Metals to reinstate the Minnesota leases that Biden had canceled. Pressure, meanwhile, grew for the world to stop using artisanal cobalt. Quote, "How am I free if I know kids are still working in the cobalt mines in the Congo making Teslas," end quote, said Kyrie Irving, the professional U.S. basketball player, on social media.
Ernest, thank you so much for the book, for your hard work reporting it, and for joining us today. Colleagues, if you would give him a warm appreciation.